Dr. James Richardson's tweezers stopped mid-extraction, his steady surgeon's hands trembling for the first time in 25 years. The sterile silence of the examination room shattered as something impossible writhed in the metal instrument's grip. This wasn't a typical infection or cyst. Nurse Patricia Chen stumbled backward, her medical tray clattering to the floor as instruments scattered like fallen leaves. The second nurse gripped the doorframe, knuckles white, unable to look away from what was emerging from Margaret O'Connor's neck. Margaret's weathered fingers clutched her late husband's wedding ring hanging from a chain, remembering how Tom used to kiss that exact spot on her neck every morning for 43 years. Now, something had been living there, growing there, for weeks. "Get the specimen container, now!" Richardson's voice cracked with urgency, though his medical training warred against the impossibility before him. What had chosen Margaret O'Connor as its host, and why was it still moving? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret Maggie O'Connor had always believed that home was where you hung your heart, and hers had been hanging in the same rustic cabin in Glacier National Park, Montana, for 46 years. At 68, with silver hair that caught the morning light streaming through Tom's handmade windows, she still wore his oversized flannel shirts like armor against the loneliness that had settled into her bones 3 years ago. The cabin stood defiant against time itself, every creaking board and weathered shingle a testament to the love Tom had poured into building their forever home. But forever had ended too soon, leaving Maggie with an $847 monthly pension that forced impossible choices between her heart medication and the heating bills that mounted higher each bitter Montana winter. "God helps those who help themselves," she'd mutter each morning, clutching her coffee mug, Tom's favorite, chipped but irreplaceable, while scanning the pile of medical bills that seemed to multiply like weeds. The kitchen table where they'd shared 43 years of breakfast conversations now served as her battlefield against financial ruin. Her daughter Sarah's monthly phone calls from New York City had grown increasingly strained, filled with subtle suggestions about making changes and being practical at your age, Mom. At 35, Sarah had inherited Tom's stubborn streak and Maggie's fierce independence, creating a collision course of two women who loved each other but couldn't agree on what love looked like. The photograph on Maggie's nightstand captured their last happy moment together. Tom's arms wrapped around her at the very hiking spot where he'd proposed, his compass glinting in the sunlight with its true north inscription. That compass now sat in his workshop, untouched since the day cancer finally claimed him, surrounded by half-finished projects that would remain forever incomplete. Whitefish, Montana, population 7,608, knew Margaret O'Connor as the elementary school teacher who'd shaped 4 decades of young minds with patience and wisdom. Mrs. Henderson next door still brought over fresh-baked bread, and the mailman, Pete, always asked about her arthritis. They cared, but they also respected her pride, that same fierce independence that kept her walking 2 miles to the grocery store rather than accept rides. In the evenings, Maggie would tend her small garden, talking to Tom's memory as if he were still there, sharing neighborhood gossip and worrying about their granddaughter Emma in California. 8-year-old Emma's video calls were Maggie's only glimpse into a future that felt increasingly uncertain, especially when the child would ask, "Grandma, when are you coming to visit me?" The answer, never, because she couldn't afford the plane ticket, remained unspoken. The workshop held their dreams, blueprints for the bigger house they'd never built, love letters Tom had written during his final hospital stay, camping gear that smelled like pine trees and better days. It was there, among the ghosts of their shared adventures, that everything would change. The morning Margaret decided to clean Tom's workshop arrived with the kind of crystalline Montana sunshine that made promises feel possible again. She'd been avoiding that sacred space for 3 years, but something in the way the light caught the dust motes dancing through the window seemed like Tom himself beckoning her forward. "Well, old man," she whispered to his photograph, "I suppose it's time." The workshop door protested with a groan that echoed through her chest as she stepped into the cathedral of their shared dreams. Tom's tools hung exactly where he'd left them, his reading glasses still folded beside blueprints for the bigger house they'd planned to build after retirement, the one with the wraparound porch and room for Emma to visit every summer. The air tasted of sawdust and memory, heavy with the weight of conversations they'd never finish. Margaret's weathered hands traced the workbench where Tom had carved her initials inside a heart during their first year of marriage, when everything seemed infinite and time was something other people worried about. A coffee can still held his collection of interesting rocks and bottle caps, treasures he'd gather on their camping trips, while she laughed at his childlike wonder. "Pack rat," she'd tease, but she'd kept every single one. Behind a stack of Field Stream magazines from 1987, she discovered something that stopped her breathing entirely, a shoebox tied with the blue ribbon from her wedding bouquet. Inside lay dozens of love letters, written in Tom's careful handwriting during those long hospital nights when neither of them could sleep. She'd never seen these before. "My dearest Maggie," the first one began. "If you're reading this, I've run out of time to tell you all the things I should have said every day. You are the compass that always points me home." Her hands shook as she read letter after letter, each one a small explosion of love she thought she'd already received in full. One letter mentioned their old camping gear stored in the back corner, where Tom had hidden what he called insurance for the future, whatever that meant. Margaret pushed aside dusty tarps and forgotten Christmas decorations until she found the familiar green canvas of their tent, the sleeping bags that had kept them warm through countless adventures in Yellowstone and Glacier. As she lifted Tom's sleeping bag, something sharp caught the soft skin of her neck, just below her left ear. "Damn it, Tom," she muttered, touching the spot and feeling the tiniest puncture, probably from a loose tent stake or broken zipper. A drop of blood came away on her fingertip, but it was nothing compared to the paper cut that had required 12 stitches the time Tom tried to fix the roof. The pain was insignificant compared to what she found next. Tom's compass, the one from their engagement day, sitting atop a sealed envelope marked, "For my true north." Inside, blueprints for their dream house, but also something else, a letter dated just 3 days before he died. "Maggie, my love, I've been doing research about the area around our cabin. There are things in these woods that most folks don't understand, but I think they might help keep you safe after I'm gone. I know how stubborn you are about accepting help, so I'm arranging help you can't refuse. Trust the process, even when it doesn't make sense. Love finds a way, even when we think it's impossible." Margaret sank onto an overturned bucket, the letter trembling in her grip. Trust what process? What had Tom been planning in those final days when the morphine made him speak in riddles? She touched the tiny wound on her neck again, already forgetting about it as the magnitude of these hidden letters overwhelmed her. The afternoon disappeared as she read every single letter, crying the tears she'd been too proud to shed at his funeral. Tom had known her so completely. Her fears about being alone, her worries about becoming a burden to Sarah, her dreams of seeing Emma grow up. He'd written contingency plans for her loneliness, suggestions for staying connected to the community, even ideas for turning their cabin into something that could generate a little income. When her phone rang, Sarah's name appearing on the cracked screen like a summons back to reality, Margaret almost didn't answer. She'd been living in the past for hours, wrapped in Tom's words like the flannel shirt she refused to donate. "Mom?" You sound different. Everything okay? Sarah's voice carried that familiar note of concern that had grown sharper since Tom's death, the tone of someone bracing for bad news. I'm fine, honey. Just cleaning out some old things. Margaret touched the small wound on her neck absently. It wasn't even worth mentioning. Sarah worried enough already. Mom, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we talked about some changes. I mean, you're 68 and living alone in the middle of nowhere. What if something happened? The same conversation, different day. Margaret felt the familiar wall rising between them, brick by brick. Sarah, we've been through this. I'm not ready to leave my home. But, Mom, your father and I built this life together. I'm not abandoning it because time has made me inconvenient. The silence stretched between Montana and New York like a canyon neither knew how to cross. Finally, Sarah sighed, the sound of someone picking battles carefully. We'll talk about it when I visit next month, okay? I love you, Mom. Love you too, sweetheart. After hanging up, Margaret sat in the workshop until the sun painted everything golden, reading Tom's letters again and again. The tiny wound on her neck had already stopped bleeding, forgotten in the emotional archaeology of her afternoon. She had no way of knowing that something microscopic had already begun its work, that Tom's mysterious insurance for the future was about to make itself known in ways she couldn't imagine. As darkness fell, Margaret carefully returned everything to the shoebox except Tom's compass, which she carried back to the house. She wound the antique timepiece he'd restored and set it on her nightstand, where its gentle ticking could lull her to sleep like a mechanical heartbeat. She touched the tiny wound one last time before brushing her teeth, wondering idly if she should put some antibiotic ointment on it. But it was so small, barely visible in the bathroom mirror, and she'd survived worse scratches from her rose garden. Besides, she was tougher than a $2 steak, as Tom used to say. This was nothing, nothing at all. 2 weeks after cleaning Tom's workshop, Margaret noticed the tiny puncture wound on her neck had developed into something more concerning. What started as a mosquito bite-sized bump had grown to the size of a marble, tender to the touch and slightly warm. She told herself it was nothing, probably just an infected hair follicle or a cyst like the one her sister Betty had removed last year. At 68, these things happened. The morning Sarah's rental car pulled into the gravel driveway unannounced, Margaret was sitting on the front porch with her coffee, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and amber. The sound of expensive tires on Tom's carefully laid stones made her stomach clench with foreboding. Sarah never visited without calling first, never arrived before noon, and certainly never looked this determined as she climbed out of the car clutching a manila folder. Mom. Sarah's embrace felt different, tighter, more desperate, like someone saying goodbye. She was thinner than during her last visit, her New York polish unable to hide the stress lines around her eyes. We need to talk. Well, good morning to you too, sunshine. Margaret kept her voice light, but her hand instinctively went to her neck, covering the growing bump with her palm. Coffee's fresh if you want some. Sarah's gaze followed the gesture, her expression sharpening with concern. Mom, what's that on your neck? Nothing, just a little bump. You know how these things are at my age. Margaret forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to her own ears. Now, what brings you all the way from the big city without so much as a phone call? The manila folder landed on the porch table with a thud that seemed to echo through the morning stillness. Real estate brochures spilled out like autumn leaves, glossy photographs of assisted living facilities, senior communities, active adult lifestyle centers with names like Sunset Manor and Golden Years Village. Sarah Elizabeth O'Connor, what in the Lord's name is this? Mom, please, just hear me out. Sarah pulled up Tom's old rocking chair, the one he'd built for the porch where they'd planned to grow old together. I've been doing research. There are some really nice places, with activities and medical care on site, where you could have friends your own age and— Friends my own age? Margaret's coffee mug hit the table harder than intended. What's wrong with the friends I have here? Mrs. Henderson has been my neighbor for 23 years. Pete the mailman asks about my arthritis every Tuesday. These people know me, Sarah. They knew your father. But Mom, you're isolated here. What if you fell? What if something happened to you and nobody found you for days? Sarah's voice cracked with barely controlled emotion. I can't sleep at night worrying about you. The words hung between them like smoke from a house fire, acrid and choking. Margaret studied her daughter's face, seeing past the designer clothes and perfectly styled hair to the frightened little girl who used to crawl into bed during thunderstorms. But this wasn't about fear anymore. This was about control. How long have you been planning this ambush? Margaret's voice carried the authority of 4 decades in the classroom, the tone that could silence a room full of rowdy third-graders. Sarah's shoulders sagged in defeat. Dr. Patterson called me last month. He's concerned about your medication compliance, about the unpaid bills piling up. Mom, I know about the mortgage payments you've been missing. The betrayal hit Margaret like a physical blow. Dr. Patterson, who'd delivered Sarah 35 years ago, who'd held Tom's hand during those final hospital visits, who'd promised to keep her medical information confidential. The violation felt deeper than mere gossip. It felt like the whole town conspiring against her independence. You had no right. Margaret's hand shook as she reached for her coffee, the wedding ring Tom had placed on her finger 46 years ago catching the morning light. No right to discuss my private affairs behind my back. I have every right. I'm your daughter, and I love you, and I'm watching you slowly fade away in this house that's falling apart around you. Sarah's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down cheeks, flushed with frustration. The roof leaks. The furnace is older than I am. And you're rationing your heart medication because you can't afford groceries and pills in the same month. The truth of it stung worse than any physical pain. Margaret had indeed been cutting her lisinopril in half, taking it every other day instead of daily, hoping her doctor wouldn't notice during their quarterly checkups. She'd learned to ignore the chest tightness that came with exertion, telling herself it was just age catching up with her stubborn body. This house is my home, Sarah. Your father and I poured our lives into every board and nail. We planned to die here together, in the bedroom where you took your first steps, surrounded by 46 years of memories. I won't be shuffled off to some sterile facility to play bingo and wait for death. Then what's your solution? Sarah pulled out a yellow legal pad covered in her neat handwriting, lists and budgets and timelines that reduced Margaret's life to numbers on a page. You've got maybe 6 months before the bank forecloses. Your Social Security barely covers utilities. And now you've got some kind of growth on your neck that you're ignoring because you're too proud to see a doctor. Margaret's hand went instinctively to the bump, which had indeed grown larger over the past few days. Sometimes, especially at night, she could swear she felt it moving slightly, like a second pulse beneath her skin. But that was impossible. Probably just her imagination running wild in the darkness when sleep eluded her. I'm giving you 30 days, Mom. Sarah's voice had taken on the ruthless efficiency that had made her successful in corporate marketing. 30 days to figure out a realistic plan for your future. If you can't, I'm going to petition the court for guardianship and make these decisions for you. The word guardianship hit Margaret like ice water. She'd seen it happen to Eleanor Hutchins down the road. One day, she was an independent widow. The next, her own son was controlling her checkbook and deciding which doctor she could see. Eleanor had died 6 months later in a nursing home in Billings, calling for her late husband and asking why her garden wasn't being watered. You wouldn't. But even as Margaret said it, she could see in Sarah's eyes that she absolutely would. Love, twisted by desperation and geography, had become indistinguishable from control. I don't want to, Mom. I really don't. but I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's clearly not. Sarah gathered the brochures back into the folder with mechanical precision. 30 days. Please, just promise me you'll think about it. Margaret's silence stretched long enough for a mourning dove to call from Tom's oak tree, the sound lonely and haunting in the crystalline morning air. Finally she nodded. Not agreement, but acknowledgement that the battle lines had been drawn. As Sarah's rental car disappeared down the gravel driveway, Margaret remained on the porch, her hand covering the growing bump on her neck. For the first time since Tom's death, she felt truly alone, abandoned by the very person she'd sacrificed everything to raise and protect. The mountains stood unchanged around her, indifferent to human drama, eternal witnesses to the cycles of love and loss that played out in the shadows of their peaks. But even mountains, Margaret reflected bitterly, could be moved with enough dynamite and determination. 30 days. The ultimatum echoed in her mind as she touched the mysterious growth on her neck, wondering if her time was running out in more ways than one. The third week after Sarah's ultimatum brought a heat wave that made even the mountains shimmer like mirages, and with it came changes that Margaret could no longer ignore. The bump on her neck had grown to the size of a walnut, tender and warm to the touch, accompanied by a low-grade fever that left her feeling drained despite her stubborn refusal to slow down. She still walked to Henderson's market every Tuesday, still tended her garden in the early morning coolness, still maintained the routines that had anchored her life since Tom's death. But the sleepless nights were getting worse. Sometimes, lying in the darkness of their bedroom, she could swear she felt movement beneath her skin, a subtle shifting that made her press her palm against the swelling and whisper prayers she hadn't said since childhood. "Just my imagination," she told Tom's photograph, but her voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Henderson noticed first, appearing at Margaret's kitchen door with a pan of fresh cornbread and eyes sharp with concern. At 72, Eleanor Henderson had outlived 2 husbands and raised 5 children, giving her an almost supernatural ability to sense trouble brewing in her neighbors. "Maggie, honey, you look peaked as a wet cat," she announced, setting the cornbread on the counter and studying Margaret's face with the intensity of a medical examiner. "When's the last time you saw Doc Patterson?" "I'm fine, Eleanor. Just tired from this heat." Margaret automatically touched her neck, a gesture that had become as unconscious as breathing. She'd taken to wearing high-collared shirts and scarves, even in the sweltering weather, hoping to hide the growing evidence of whatever was happening to her body. "That's a load of horse hockey, and you know it." Eleanor's weathered hands were surprisingly gentle as she lifted Margaret's chin, her expression darkening when she saw the visible swelling beneath the carefully arranged scarf. "Lord have mercy, Maggie. How long has that been there?" "It's nothing. Just a cyst or something. These things happen when you get to be our age." "Our age, my foot? I've seen plenty of cysts in my day, and they don't move around like that one's doing." Eleanor's voice carried the authority of someone who'd nursed half the county through various ailments. "You're going to see Dr. Patterson today, and don't you dare argue with me." The argument that followed echoed through the small cabin like a tennis match between 2 equally stubborn players. Eleanor wielded guilt with surgical precision, reminding Margaret of her responsibilities to Sarah, to her granddaughter Emma, to the students who still sent her Christmas cards after all these years. Margaret countered with pride and independence, insisting she could handle her own medical decisions without interference from well-meaning neighbors. The debate ended only when Margaret's knees buckled during a particularly emphatic gesture, sending her stumbling against the kitchen counter. The brief spell of dizziness passed quickly, but not before Eleanor had seen the flash of genuine fear in her friend's eyes. "That settles it," Eleanor declared, reaching for her car keys. "We're going to the clinic right now before this heat gets any worse." Dr. James Patterson's office sat on Main Street between Miller's Hardware and the post office, occupying the same building where he'd practiced medicine for 37 years. At 61, he'd delivered most of the babies in Whitefish, including Sarah, and had guided their families through every medical crisis from chickenpox to cancer. His waiting room still smelled of disinfectant and old magazines, a comforting constant in a world that seemed to change faster each year. When Margaret reluctantly allowed him to examine the swelling on her neck, his normally cheerful demeanor shifted into something more serious. His fingers probed gently around the area, his brow furrowing as he felt the distinct movement beneath her skin. "Maggie, I'm going to be straight with you," he said, settling back in his chair with the weight of 3 decades of difficult conversations. "This isn't a typical cyst. There's definitely something moving in there, and I think we need to get you to someone with more specialized equipment." "Specialized equipment?" Margaret's voice came out smaller than intended. "What kind of specialized equipment?" "I'd like to refer you to Dr. James Richardson at Kalispell Regional. He's a dermatological surgeon, younger than me, but with excellent credentials. He'll be able to do an ultrasound, maybe a CT scan, figure out exactly what we're dealing with here." The words CT scan hit Margaret like a physical blow, bringing back memories of Tom's diagnosis, the hours spent in sterile waiting rooms, the mounting medical bills, the gradual erosion of their savings as his cancer progressed. She thought of Sarah's ultimatum, of the 30-day deadline that was approaching like a storm front, of the mortgage payments she'd already missed. "Dr. Patterson, I appreciate your concern, but I can't afford—" "Maggie." His voice carried the gentle firmness of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. "Your insurance will cover the consultation, and if there's something seriously wrong, delaying treatment won't make it any cheaper or any easier." That evening, alone in the cabin that suddenly felt too big and too quiet, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, trying to calculate impossible math. The numbers never worked out right. Social Security minus utilities minus groceries minus medications minus the mortgage payment she'd already missed twice left her with choices no person should have to make. She pulled out Tom's letters again, rereading the one about insurance for the future and his mysterious research about the area around their cabin. What had he discovered in those final weeks? What kind of help had he been trying to arrange? The morphine had made him talk in riddles sometimes, speaking about protection and love finding a way, but she'd attributed it to medication and approaching death. Her reflection was interrupted by her phone buzzing with a video call from California. Emma's 8-year-old face filled the screen, gap-toothed and glowing with excitement about her upcoming school play. "Grandma, guess what? I got picked to be the narrator in our play about pioneers." "I get to wear a bonnet and everything." Margaret forced her brightest smile, the one she'd perfected during 40 years of teaching when she needed to hide her own troubles from her students. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." "Mom says maybe you can come watch me perform. Can you, Grandma? Please?" The innocent question pierced Margaret's heart like a blade. California might as well have been Mars, for all the likelihood of her affording the trip. "I'd love to, Emma. Let me see what I can figure out." After the call ended, Margaret sat in the gathering darkness, her hand pressed against the growing swelling on her neck. The movement beneath her skin seemed more pronounced now, almost rhythmic, like a second heartbeat, keeping time with her own. For the first time since Tom's death, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she might not have as much time left as she'd assumed. The appointment with Dr. Richardson was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Margaret marked it on her calendar with a red pen, circling the date like a deadline. Whatever was growing inside her neck was accelerating, and she could no longer pretend it was something benign that would resolve itself with time and stubbornness. As she prepared for bed, Margaret caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back seemed older than her 68 years, worn down by grief and worry and the relentless mathematics of poverty. But her eyes still held the same determination that had carried her through 4 decades of teaching, through Tom's illness, through the lonely years since his death. "Whatever this is," she told her reflection, "I won't go down without a fight." The swelling pulsed gently beneath her fingertips, as if responding to her words with some unknowable purpose of its own. The morning of her appointment with Dr. Richardson arrived gray and threatening, with clouds hanging low over the mountains like smoke from distant fires. Margaret stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her best blouse for the third time, trying to disguise the swelling that had grown to the size of a small egg. The drive to Kalispell Regional Medical Center would take 45 minutes, and she'd insisted on driving herself despite Eleanor Henderson's offers to accompany her. Pride, Tom had always said, was both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. Today, as she climbed into her 15-year-old Subaru with its temperamental heating system and optimistic mileage, she wondered if he'd been more right than she'd cared to admit, Doctor. James Richardson turned out to be younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of genuine smile that reminded her of former students who'd grown up to become good people. His office walls displayed medical degrees from universities she recognized, certificates of specialization, and a single photograph of what appeared to be his family at a lake somewhere, all sunshine and genuine happiness. "Mrs. O'Connor, Dr. Patterson spoke very highly of you," he said, settling into his chair with a file folder that seemed surprisingly thick for someone he'd never met. "He mentioned you were an elementary school teacher for many years. 40 years at Whitefish Elementary. Retired 3 years ago when my husband got sick." The words came automatically, but saying them still felt like explaining a life that belonged to someone else, someone who'd had purpose and daily meaning beyond managing pills and counting pennies. "That's quite a legacy. I imagine you touched a lot of lives in 4 decades. His voice carried genuine warmth, not the practiced sympathy she'd grown accustomed to from medical professionals. "Now, let's take a look at what's been troubling you." When Margaret reluctantly unwound the scarf from her neck, Dr. Richardson's expression shifted into something more serious, though he maintained the calm professionalism that came with years of training. His examination was thorough but gentle, his fingers probing the swollen area with the careful precision of someone who understood that every touch might cause discomfort. "How long would you say this has been developing, Mrs. O'Connor?" "About 3 weeks, maybe a little more. Started as just a tiny bump, like a mosquito bite." Margaret's voice sounded steadier than she felt. "It's been growing pretty consistently since then." "Any pain, fever, changes in your energy level?" The honest answer would have included the sleepless nights, the low-grade fever that came and went like an unwelcome visitor, the strange sensation of movement beneath her skin that she'd convinced herself was imagination. Instead, she offered a carefully edited version that downplayed her symptoms without outright lying. Dr. Richardson made notes in her file, his pen scratching across paper in the particular rhythm of doctors everywhere. "I'd like to do an ultrasound first, just to get a better sense of what we're dealing with. The imaging will help us determine the best course of action." The ultrasound room felt cold despite the warm day outside, all sterile surfaces and humming machinery that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of Tom's final weeks in the hospital. She lay on the examination table staring at the ceiling tiles while Dr. Richardson moved the ultrasound wand across her neck, his expression growing more puzzled with each pass. "That's interesting," he murmured, adjusting the machine's settings and trying different angles. "Mrs. O'Connor, have you ever traveled outside the United States, particularly to Central or South America?" "Tom and I went to Mexico for our 25th anniversary, but that was 18 years ago." Why? Dr. Richardson paused the examination, studying the monitor with the intensity of someone solving a complex puzzle. I'm seeing something I've never encountered in my practice here in Montana. The ultrasound shows what appears to be a foreign body, something that's definitely not supposed to be there, but well, it's moving in ways that suggest it might be organic. The word organic hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications Margaret didn't want to explore. What does that mean exactly? I think we need to remove it, Mrs. O'Connor. Today, if you're willing. This is the kind of situation where waiting could make things more complicated. His voice carried the careful authority of someone delivering news that wasn't quite bad, but wasn't exactly good either. I can do the procedure here in the office under local anesthesia. It should be relatively straightforward. Margaret's mind immediately went to the cost. The procedure, the follow-up care, the medications she couldn't afford. Her insurance had co-pays and deductibles that might as well have been ransom demands for someone living on $847 a month. Doctor, I need to be honest with you about my financial situation. I'm on a fixed income and my insurance— Mrs. O'Connor, he interrupted gently. Let's worry about your health first and figure out the financial details later. I've been known to work with patients on payment plans, especially retired teachers who spent their careers serving the community. The kindness in his voice nearly broke through the careful composure she'd maintained throughout the appointment. Margaret thought of Tom's letters, his mysterious mentions of insurance for the future, his certainty that love would find a way even when circumstances seemed impossible. All right, doctor, let's do this. The procedure room felt smaller than the examination room, more intimate and somehow more ominous. Dr. Richardson's nurse, Patricia Chen, prepared the instruments with practiced efficiency while explaining each step in the soothing tones of someone who'd guided countless patients through minor surgical procedures. You'll feel a small pinch when I inject the lidocaine, Dr. Richardson explained, his hand steady as he prepared the syringe. After that, you shouldn't feel any pain, just some pressure as I work. The lidocaine burned initially, then gradually numbed the entire left side of Margaret's neck. She stared at the ceiling, counting tiles and thinking about Emma's school play, about the garden that would need watering when she got home, about anything except what was happening beneath the surgical drape. Almost there, Dr. Richardson murmured, his voice tight with concentration. This is— Mrs. O'Connor, I need you to stay very still for the next few minutes. What I'm finding here is quite unusual. Margaret felt pressure, a tugging sensation that seemed to go deeper than she'd expected. Dr. Richardson and Nurse Chen exchanged glances over her draped form, their expressions shifting from routine professionalism to something approaching amazement. Patricia, can you get me the specimen container? The large one. His voice carried a note of excitement mixed with disbelief. Mrs. O'Connor, I want you to know that in 15 years of practice I have never seen anything quite like this. The tugging sensation continued, accompanied by a strange sense of relief, as if pressure she hadn't realized she was carrying was finally being released. Margaret found herself thinking of Tom's compass, of his certainty that it would always point toward true north no matter how lost they might become. There, Dr. Richardson said finally, his voice filled with satisfaction and wonder. Got it. Margaret heard the soft sound of something being placed in a metal container, followed by the rustle of surgical instruments being set aside. When Dr. Richardson finally moved the drape so she could see his face, his expression was one of professional amazement mixed with genuine concern. Mrs. O'Connor, what I just removed from your neck is going to require some additional analysis. I've never seen anything like it in North America, and I need to send it to the lab to determine exactly what we're dealing with. Is it cancer? The question came out smaller than intended, carrying all the fear she'd been holding back for weeks. No, Definitely not cancer. It's organic, as I suspected, but not malignant. More like—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "More like a parasite of some kind, though that shouldn't be possible given our geographic location and climate." Parasite. The word echoed in Margaret's mind as Dr. Richardson cleaned and bandaged the incision site, as Nurse Chen explained the aftercare instructions, as she scheduled the follow-up appointment she wasn't sure she could afford. A parasite that had been living inside her neck, growing for weeks, moving beneath her skin like some nightmare made manifest. As she drove home through the mountain valleys that had been her sanctuary for 46 years, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The infection began 3 days after the procedure, despite Margaret's careful adherence to Dr. Richardson's aftercare instructions. What started as normal post-surgical tenderness transformed into angry red streaks radiating from the bandaged incision site, accompanied by a fever that spiked to 102 degrees and left her shivering beneath Tom's old quilts in the sweltering July heat. Margaret had weathered countless minor illnesses during her teaching years. Every flu strain, stomach bug, and childhood ailment that circulated through Whitefish Elementary had found its way to her classroom. But this felt different, more sinister, as if her body was fighting a battle it wasn't equipped to win. She'd called Dr. Richardson's office twice, leaving messages with his service, but hadn't heard back despite promises of prompt return calls. The morning Sarah's frantic voice echoed through the cabin, Margaret was barely conscious on the living room couch, having abandoned any pretense of sleeping in the bedroom where Tom's absence felt too vast to bear. Sarah had driven straight through from New York after Margaret failed to answer her regularly scheduled Sunday phone call, arriving to find her mother delirious with fever and the surgical site showing clear signs of serious infection. "Mom. Oh, God. Mom. What happened?" Sarah's voice cracked with panic as she knelt beside the couch, her hand pressed against Margaret's burning forehead. The confident corporate executive who'd delivered ultimatums just weeks earlier had disappeared, replaced by a terrified daughter facing the possibility of losing the only parent she had left. Margaret's eyes struggled to focus on Sarah's face, seeing instead shadowy figures that her fever-addled brain insisted were Tom coming to take her home. "Sarah? When did you get here?" "You didn't need to come all this way." "Mom, you're burning up. We need to get you to the hospital right now." Sarah was already gathering medications from the kitchen counter, her movements sharp with barely controlled fear. "What did the doctor say about this infection? Are you taking antibiotics?" The truth was that Margaret couldn't afford the prescription antibiotics Dr. Richardson had ordered, couldn't afford the follow-up appointment that would have caught the infection before it became life-threatening. She'd been treating herself with over-the-counter pain relievers and home remedies, hoping her body would heal itself the way it had through 6 decades of minor injuries and illnesses. "Can't afford." Margaret's words came out slurred, her tongue thick with fever. "Insurance. Copay. Bills." Sarah's face went white as understanding hit her. "Mom, you didn't fill your antibiotic prescription." "Because of money?" Her voice rose to a pitch that Margaret recognized from Sarah's childhood tantrums, though this time fear, rather than frustration, drove the emotion. The drive to Kalispell Regional became a blur of mountain curves and Sarah's increasingly frantic phone calls to every medical contact she could remember. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes seeing the familiar landscape of her childhood, sometimes Tom's face bending over her with that gentle smile he'd worn during her bout with pneumonia 20 years earlier. Emergency room triage moved with the efficient urgency of professionals who'd seen sepsis before and understood its unforgiving timeline. Within minutes, Margaret found herself surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed, IV lines carrying antibiotics directly into her bloodstream, while nurses monitored her vital signs with grave expressions. Dr. Richardson appeared in her room like an answer to prayers Sarah had forgotten how to pray, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious concern. "Mrs. O'Connor, why didn't you call me when the infection started? We could have caught this much earlier." Sarah answered for her unconscious mother, her voice carrying the bitter edge of someone discovering uncomfortable truths. "She couldn't afford the antibiotics you prescribed. She couldn't afford the follow-up appointment. She's been choosing between medication and food for months, and I've been too busy with my own life to pay attention." The silence that followed felt heavy with implications no one wanted to examine too closely. Dr. Richardson made notes in Margaret's chart, his pen scratching across paper with the sound of professional frustration. "The lab results from the specimen I removed are unusual. I've never seen anything like it, frankly. But right now, our priority is getting this infection under control." Margaret remained hospitalized for 6 days, floating in and out of consciousness while powerful antibiotics battled the infection that had spread through her bloodstream. Sarah never left the hospital, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs and surviving on vending machine coffee, making phone calls to arrange extended leave from her New York job, and trying to untangle the financial crisis that had been building in Margaret's life for months. The bills arrived like vultures gathering around carrion: hospital charges, physician fees, laboratory costs, pharmacy expenses that added up to more money than Margaret's pension provided in an entire year. Sarah spread them across the cafeteria table during one of her brief breaks from her mother's bedside, calculator in hand, trying to find some mathematical solution to an impossible equation. $37,000, she whispered to herself, staring at the total with the blank expression of someone processing incomprehensible numbers. How is that even possible for 6 days? The insurance adjustments helped, but not enough. Margaret's Medicare coverage included gaps and co-pays that assumed patients had savings or family support systems. The remaining balance, nearly $15,000, might as well have been $15 million for a woman whose monthly income barely covered basic living expenses. Dr. Richardson found Sarah in the cafeteria at 2 in the morning, her head buried in her hands, surrounded by medical bills and financial statements that painted a stark picture of Margaret's situation. He sat down across from her without invitation, his own exhaustion evident after a 17-hour shift that had included 3 emergency surgeries. "Your mother is going to recover," he said simply. "The antibiotics are working, her fever broke this afternoon, and the infection markers are dropping steadily." Sarah looked up with eyes red from crying and exhaustion. "Thank you, doctor. I don't know how to thank you enough." "You can thank me by helping her understand that her health is more important than her pride." His voice carried the gentle firmness of someone who'd had similar conversations with countless families. "Mrs. O'Connor is one of the strongest people I've ever met. But strength without support is just stubbornness. She won't accept help. She's been independent her whole life, and asking for assistance feels like failure to her." Sarah's voice cracked with the weight of understanding her mother's perspective, while simultaneously feeling helpless to change it. "Then don't ask her permission. Sometimes love means making decisions for people we care about, even when they resist." Dr. Richardson pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. "There's a social worker here at the hospital who specializes in cases like your mother's. She might have options you haven't considered." The next morning, Margaret woke to find Sarah sitting beside her bed, holding her hand with the desperate tenderness of someone who'd almost lost everything that mattered. Sunlight streamed through the hospital window, painting everything in shades of gold that reminded Margaret of morning coffee on her front porch, of better days when the future seemed manageable. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Sarah's voice was carefully controlled, but Margaret could hear the underlying tremor of recent fear. "Like I've been hit by a logging truck." Margaret's throat felt raw from the breathing tube they'd used during the worst of her illness, but her mind was clearer than it had been in days. "Sarah, you should be back in New York. You have a job, responsibilities." "Mom, stop." Sarah's interruption was gentle but firm. "We need to talk about some things. About money, about your health, about the future. And this time, I need you to listen without arguing." Margaret saw something different in her daughter's face. Not the controlling determination that had characterized their recent conversations, but something deeper and more desperate. Sarah had been forced to confront the possibility of losing her mother, and the experience had changed something fundamental in how she understood their relationship. "I've been such a fool," Sarah whispered, tears flowing freely now. "I've been so focused on what I thought was best for you that I never asked what you actually needed. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." As Margaret reached up to touch her daughter's face, she realized that sometimes the most devastating storms cleared the air for conversations that should have happened years earlier. The revelation came not from Dr. Richardson's medical expertise, but from an unexpected phone call that shattered everything Margaret thought she understood about her ordeal. She was sitting up in her hospital bed for the first time in a week, slowly sipping chicken broth while Sarah dozed in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, when Dr. Richardson appeared in the doorway with an expression that mixed professional excitement with something approaching disbelief. "Mrs. O'Connor, I have some rather extraordinary news about the specimen we removed from your neck," he began, settling into the chair opposite Sarah with a thick folder clutched in his hands. "The laboratory results have come back, and they've raised some very interesting questions." Margaret set down her spoon, noting the careful way he'd chosen his words. In her experience, doctors only called news interesting when they weren't quite sure how to explain something that defied their training. "What kind of questions, Doctor?" "Well, first, the good news. What we removed wasn't harmful to you in any traditional sense. In fact, the lab analysis suggests it may have been protective." He opened the folder, revealing photographs and reports covered in technical language that meant nothing to Margaret but seemed to fascinate him. "The organism appears to have been regulating certain chemical processes in your bloodstream." Sarah stirred awake at the sound of voices, immediately alert with the hypervigilance of someone who'd spent a week expecting bad news. "Protective? What does that mean?" Dr. Richardson spread several laboratory photographs across Margaret's bedside table, each showing microscopic images that looked more like abstract art than medical evidence. "Your mother's blood work from the past 6 months shows some anomalies that we initially attributed to her age and medication regimen. But looking at the pattern now, it appears this organism was actually helping to regulate her heart medication levels." Margaret stared at the incomprehensible images, feeling a strange stirring of memory. "Doctor, this is going to sound crazy, but my late husband mentioned something about protection. In some letters I found after he died, he'd been doing research about unusual wildlife in our area." "What kind of research?" Dr. Richardson leaned forward with the intensity of someone sensing a breakthrough in a complex puzzle. "I don't really understand it. He was on a lot of pain medication near the end, and sometimes he talked about things that didn't make much sense. But he kept saying he'd arranged for some kind of protection for me, something I couldn't refuse even if I wanted to." Margaret's voice trailed off as she remembered Tom's compass, his certainty about true north, his mysterious confidence about their future. Sarah was studying the medical photographs with the analytical mind that had made her successful in corporate consulting. "Mom, when exactly did you first notice the bump on your neck?" "About 3 weeks after I cleaned out your father's workshop. I found some camping gear I hadn't seen since before he got sick, and I got a tiny scratch from something. Barely noticeable." Dr. Richardson's expression shifted into something approaching amazement. "Mrs. O'Connor, parasitic organisms like this don't typically survive in Montana's climate. They're usually found in tropical regions, and they certainly don't establish symbiotic relationships with human hosts. What we're seeing here is medically unprecedented. The word symbiotic hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications Margaret wasn't sure she wanted to explore. But before she could ask for clarification, her phone rang with a call from Eleanor Henderson, whose voice carried the breathless excitement of someone bearing important news. "Maggie, honey, you need to know something. I've been talking to some of the other ladies in town while you've been in the hospital, and it turns out you're not the only one." Eleanor's voice crackled through the phone speaker with the urgency of shared secrets. "The only one what, Eleanor?" Betty Morrison had something similar last year, right after her Harold passed. She never told anyone because she thought people would think she was losing her mind. And Susan Clark after her Robert died 2 years ago. They both had these strange bumps that doctors couldn't explain, and after they healed up, both women said they felt better than they had in years. Margaret felt the room spinning slightly, though whether from medication or shock, she couldn't determine. "Eleanor, what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe what happened to you wasn't as random as we thought. Maybe there's something about this area, something that takes care of widows who've lost their husbands." Eleanor's voice carried the conviction of someone who'd lived long enough to believe in miracles disguised as coincidences. Dr. Richardson was frantically taking notes, his medical training warring with evidence that challenged everything he thought he understood about parasitology and human biology. "Mrs. Henderson, would it be possible to speak with these other women for medical research purposes?" After Eleanor hung up with promises to arrange introductions, the hospital room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Margaret's monitors. Sarah was staring out the window at the mountains that had witnessed generations of love and loss, her expressions cycling through disbelief, wonder, and something approaching understanding. "Mom," she said finally, "do you remember Dad's last camping trip? The one he insisted on taking even though he was already sick?" Margaret did remember. Tom's determination to visit their favorite spots one final time, his insistence on going alone despite her protests, his strange serenity when he returned 3 days later. He'd seemed different somehow, more at peace with his approaching death, as if he'd made arrangements she couldn't understand. He was gone for 3 days in the backcountry near Glacier Park. When he came back, he had this look, like he'd figured something out, solved some problem that had been bothering him. Margaret's voice grew soft with memory. "He kept talking about insurance policies and love finding a way, but I thought it was just the medication making him philosophical." Dr. Richardson was studying his notes with the expression of someone trying to solve an equation with variables that shouldn't exist. "Mrs. O'Connor, I need to ask you something that might sound unusual. Have you noticed any changes in your overall health since the organism was removed? Beyond the infection, I mean." The question forced Margaret to examine sensations she'd been attributing to recovery from illness. But now that he mentioned it, she realized she felt different. Not just physically healthier, but somehow more fragile, as if a protective presence she hadn't known existed had been suddenly withdrawn. "I feel more vulnerable somehow, like something that was watching over me is gone." She touched the bandaged incision site gently. "It sounds crazy, but I miss it. Whatever it was." Sarah's medical skepticism warred with her growing acceptance of evidence that defied rational explanation. "Doctor, are you suggesting that some kind of organism was actually helping my mother? Like a medical treatment she didn't know she was receiving?" "I'm suggesting that we're dealing with something that challenges our understanding of symbiotic relationships in nature. What your mother experienced appears to be a form of biological protection that her husband somehow arranged before his death." Dr. Richardson's voice carried the careful authority of someone making a professional leap based on impossible evidence. Margaret thought of Tom's compass again, of his absolute certainty about true north even when everything else seemed uncertain. Perhaps love really did find a way, even when that way involved creatures and processes that medical science couldn't adequately explain. "Doctor," she said quietly, "is there any way to replace what was lost? If this organism was helping me and now it's gone." The question hung between them like a bridge spanning the gap between medical science and something deeper, more mysterious, more connected to the ancient rhythms of love and protection that had guided human relationships since the beginning of time. Dr. Richardson smiled, the first genuinely hopeful expression Margaret had seen from him since her hospitalization began. "Mrs. O'Connor, I think it's time we paid a visit to your husband's favorite camping spots. There might be more to discover there than we initially realized." 3 months after her release from the hospital, Margaret stood in her kitchen watching the early September light paint the mountains in shades of gold and amber, feeling stronger than she had in years. The medical bills that had once seemed insurmountable were being managed through a combination of the hospital's charity care program, Dr. Richardson's reduced fees, and Sarah's careful financial planning. More importantly, the fear that had shadowed their relationship for months had transformed into something deeper and more honest. Sarah had indeed quit her New York job, but not to become Margaret's caretaker. Instead, she'd launched a remote consulting business from the renovated guest room in the cabin, spending her days on video calls with clients while enjoying views of the same mountains that had shaped her childhood. The arrangement allowed her to maintain her professional independence while being close enough to help with grocery runs and doctor's appointments. "Mom, you've got to see this," Sarah called from the living room, her laptop balanced on the coffee table Tom had built during their first winter in the cabin. Dr. Richardson's research paper was just published in the Journal of Parasitology, and it's getting attention from universities all over the world. Margaret dried her hands on the dish towel Tom had given her for their 30th anniversary, still functional despite its frayed edges, and joined Sarah on the couch. The academic paper's title meant little to her, but the photographs were unmistakable. Microscopic images of the organism that had lived in her neck for nearly a month. "Listen to this," Sarah continued, reading from the article. "The symbiotic organism appears to respond to specific environmental and emotional triggers, establishing protective relationships with hosts experiencing grief-related stress. While the mechanism remains unclear, documented cases suggest a previously unknown form of biological adaptation to human emotional states." Dr. Richardson had become a regular visitor to their cabin over the past months, initially for medical follow-ups, but increasingly for conversations about the implications of his research. His scientific curiosity had been matched by genuine fondness for Margaret's stories about 40 years of teaching and her philosophical approach to life's unexpected challenges. "What I find most remarkable," he'd explained during his last visit, "is that your late husband somehow understood this phenomenon well enough to deliberately expose himself to it. The organism we removed from your neck showed genetic markers suggesting it had been specifically conditioned to respond to your biochemistry." Margaret had shown him Tom's letters then, the ones about insurance for the future, and love finding a way, Doctor. Richardson had read them with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a medical mystery, but Margaret suspected he understood something that transcended mere scientific curiosity. The breakthrough had come when Eleanor Henderson arranged for Dr. Richardson to interview Betty Morrison and Susan Clark, both of whom confirmed similar experiences following their husbands' deaths. All three women lived within a 15-mile radius of the same backcountry area where Tom had taken his final camping trip, and all had husbands who'd spent considerable time outdoors in their final months. "It's like they figured out how to keep protecting us even after they were gone," Betty had explained to Dr. Richardson, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd lived long enough to believe in love's more mysterious manifestations. The medical implications had attracted attention from parasitologists and grief counselors alike. But for Margaret, the most important discovery was much simpler. She was no longer alone in the way she'd feared. The organism might be gone, but the network of protection and care it represented had expanded to include Sarah's presence, Dr. Richardson's friendship, and a community that had rallied around her during her medical crisis. Emma's visit that weekend brought the cabin alive with 8-year-old energy and endless questions about everything from why mountains were blue in the distance to whether Grandma Tom was watching them from heaven. Margaret found herself energized by her granddaughter's curiosity, rediscovering the joy of teaching through Emma's eager absorption of stories about local wildlife, Montana history, and the love story that had built their family. "Grandma, Mom says you had a bug living in your neck that was taking care of you." "Is that really true?" Emma asked while they worked together in Margaret's garden, harvesting the last tomatoes of the season. "Something like that, sweetheart. Sometimes love shows up in ways we don't expect, even ways that might seem scary at first." Margaret handed Emma a perfectly ripe tomato, still warm from the sun. "Your Grandpa Tom was always good at figuring out how to take care of people." "I miss Grandpa Tom. I wish I could have met him." Emma's statement carried the uncomplicated sadness of childhood, honest and direct in ways that adult grief rarely allowed. "Oh, but you did meet him, honey. Every time you see me smile the way he used to make me smile. Every time your mom does something kind without being asked. Every time you're brave enough to try something new, that's Grandpa Tom still taking care of all of us." Sarah found them in the garden an hour later, both covered in dirt and giggling over Emma's attempts to identify different vegetables. The sight of her mother teaching her daughter with the same patient enthusiasm she'd shown countless students over 4 decades filled Sarah with a contentment she hadn't felt since childhood. That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep in Tom's old recliner while Margaret read her stories about brave pioneers and determined homesteaders, Sarah and her mother sat on the front porch watching stars emerge over the mountains that had sheltered their family for nearly half a century. "Mom, I need to tell you something," Sarah began, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone about to reveal important news. "I've been thinking about Emma's education, about what kind of life I want to give her. The schools in California are good, but they're not this." Margaret waited, understanding that her daughter was working toward something significant. "I want to move back permanently. Not just for a few months, but really move back. Emma could go to school here, the same school where you taught, and I could run my business from anywhere with good internet. What would you think about that?" The question hung between them like a bridge spanning years of misunderstanding and missed connections. Margaret thought of Tom's letters, his certainty that love would find a way, his mysterious arrangements for her protection and care. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "that your father would say love always points toward true north, and sometimes true north means coming home." Sarah's hand found Margaret's in the darkness, both women understanding that they'd found their way back to something neither had dared hope for. A future built on choice rather than obligation, on love rather than duty, on the quiet certainty that families could rebuild themselves stronger after surviving the storms that threatened to tear them apart. Dr. Richardson's research would eventually lead to a new understanding of symbiotic relationships in nature. But for Margaret O'Connor, the most important discovery was much simpler. Sometimes the most frightening experiences in life were just love wearing an unfamiliar disguise, and sometimes the greatest protection came not from avoiding change, but from embracing the unexpected ways that love continued to evolve and adapt. The organism was gone, but the love that had created it remained, now expressed through Sarah's presence, Emma's laughter, and a community that had learned to see beyond the surface of things to the deeper currents of care and connection that bound them together. As autumn settled over the mountains with its promise of winter's challenges and spring's eventual renewal, Margaret O'Connor found herself looking forward to the future for the first time since Tom's death, grateful for the mysterious ways that love had learned to keep its promises. Dear friends, Margaret O'Connor's story reminds us that love never truly dies. It simply finds new ways to protect and guide us through life's most challenging chapters. At 68, Margaret discovered that what seemed like her worst nightmare was actually her late husband Tom's final gift of protection, arranged with the mysterious wisdom that comes from a lifetime of deep love. Her journey from fear and isolation to healing and family reunion speaks to something we all understand: the terror of becoming a burden, the struggle with fixed incomes, and the profound loneliness that can follow loss. But Margaret's story also proves that our darkest moments often hide unexpected blessings. When her daughter Sarah finally understood that love means being present rather than controlling, when the community rallied around their retired teacher, when medical bills became manageable through compassion rather than wealth, these weren't coincidences. They were love working through ordinary people to create extraordinary outcomes. Sometimes what frightens us most is actually love wearing an unfamiliar disguise, waiting to transform our lives in ways we never imagined possible. Margaret thought she was facing her end, but she was actually discovering her new beginning. Share with us, what unexpected blessing have you discovered during your most challenging time? How has love shown up in your life wearing a disguise you didn't recognize at first? Please leave a comment below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.